I am captivated by your Genesis series, and we have gone through, it's at least 15 hours. You probably know exactly how much, but it's a lot of time to spend on one little book in the Bible. It happens to be an important one. But allowing the world to understand Genesis in a very different way, I think, was hugely beneficial. You're embarking on Exodus, and the story is quite different, equally profound. Why is Exodus so relevant to us right now?
Well, it looks to me, and I'm speaking scientifically here, at least to some degree, that we look at the world through a story, or alternatively, that the world reveals itself to us as a story. It's very difficult to distinguish between those two things. And stories have a structure. So the simple structure of a story is that a kindergarten child might tell you, what did you do today? Well, I went with Mom and I took her hand and we went to kindergarten for the first time. That's a little story. And you're kind of interested in it and you're kind of happy that the kid is telling it. But maybe he says, well, we were trying to go to kindergarten today and on the way, a big dog leaped up against the fence and scared me and I had to go home. Well, that's a different story altogether.
Yeah.
Right? Now, our stories are disruptible. So we lay a story on the world. And as long as that story remains intact, it tells us where to go. We have a destination in mind at every moment. Sometimes they're small destinations. You're just going downstairs to make yourself a sandwich. There's a little frame there. And that's nested inside whatever it is that you're doing that day. And then that week, and then that month, and then that year. And with your relationships. Nested stories. Well, all of those stories are disruptible. So, maybe you're going downstairs to have a peanut butter sandwich and your phone rings and you find out that your son was killed in a car accident.
Oh.
Right. Ooh, yeah. That's for sure. And then what? Well, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
And then you're in the desert for 40 years. Right? Or, maybe you're in a terrible marriage and you're married to a tyrant and you've allowed for that, but you're married to a tyrant and finally the marriage dissolves and you think, oh my God, I'm free of the tyranny. And then you're faced with the chaos of your own unexamined life. And so now you're in the desert for 40 years. Because even if you escape from a tyrant, that doesn't mean that you're now in the promised land. It means that everything is falling apart around you. And then you're going to be tempted to worship false idols, which is precisely the position that we're in today in the political realm. And you have to work to reach the promised land. And even if you're Moses and you know the law, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're ever going to get there. And so that story will never die. Even if it was destroyed completely, it would reemerge, assuming that there were still human beings around and thinking. And this story is unbelievably profound, especially, for example, in its insistence that merely escaping from tyranny does not deliver you. All that happens is something equally bad, but opposite. I mean, that's harsh. That's harsh. The West, the United States most particularly, attempted to free Iraq from a tyranny. Well, what happened? Was everyone immediately delivered to the promised land of democracy and peace? No. Chaos. Chaos. That's what happens when tyranny disappears. Chaos. Well, then what do? Well, you figure out what the rules are. You try to abide by them. And then you try to become the embodiment of the spirit of those rules. And so that's what Christ's commentary, for example, on the Sermon on the Mount. And also when he's asked by someone who's trying to trip him up what the most important commandments are, he abstracts out the spirit of the law and says the things that he says. And what's the true deliverance from tyranny and chaos? Well, it's the embodiment of the proper mode of being. And what is that? Well, that's allegiance to the divine word. That's one way of thinking about it. You think, well, how can you believe that? It's like, well, people, they've been thinking about that for like 50,000 years. And if you think those people were stupid, that just means you don't understand what they were doing. So, and you think, well, what's allegiance to the divine word? Well, it's a recognition that there's such a thing as truth and falsehood, and that that's of vital importance, and that you have to differentiate between those, and that you are bound ethically, even despite your own wishes, either to ally yourself to some degree with the truth or to suffer the slings and arrows of conscience. And so all of that's tangled up in Exodus and much, much more. So
let's
it's
break
inexhaustible.
Let's break it down. What's the significance of Moses being born a slave, rescued from the water, and then becoming royalty? What does that transition mean for the patriarch to be both?
Well, we're all born insufficient and in slavery to some degree. You know, that's true. You see that echoed again in the story of Christ, because he's born under lowly conditions and is vulnerable. And of course, Moses also faces the potential death of all the firstborn Hebrews, right? Well, why is that? Well, it's because babies are vulnerable. To what? Well, biological catastrophe and social tyranny. And that's the case for all of us. And then Moses spans the entire, what would you say, the entire domain of social status, because he has to be everyone in some sense for the story to work. And so, and I suppose because he's a good man, the mere fact that he, what would you say, is placed in a position of undeserved privilege does not free him from his moral burden. Not at all. And so merely being positioned arbitrarily in a social hierarchy doesn't exhaust what it means to be an ethical person. Not at all. And in fact, I would say, in a very real sense, barring outright, mortal privation, there's no evidence to suggest that being born more fortunate and privileged is less of an impediment to genuine ethical accomplishment than being born in privation and difficulty. And that's another reason why, in some real sense, there's a profound equality of value that characterizes each person.
So Moses has this unique background, and I'll just fast forward. He challenges Pharaoh. He rejects the royalty element of who he was born into, effectively. And he brings 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. Why plagues? Ironically, we're in one now. Why 10? And how did that advance the story as the Jews?
Plagues is partly, I'm going to speak more metaphorically here, is that whenever a natural catastrophe occurs, the question arises, is this to be laid at the feet of arbitrary nature or God, or is this a reflection of our own insufficient preparation because of our unexamined tyranny and authoritarianism and corruption? So, for example, apparently New Orleans is much more protected against hurricanes than it was when it was so devastated a few decades ago. Why was it devastated?
I was in Katrina. I witnessed it firsthand. It's definitely better, but the whole country decided we weren't going to other New Orleans.
Right, and so things were fixed, and so now New Orleans can resist hurricanes to a much greater degree than it could. The levees were not what they should have been, and a big part of that was a consequence of political corruption. And so was a hurricane a natural disaster, or was it a failure as a consequence of tyranny? Yeah. And that's part of what's happening with the plague. And so the Pharaoh, who thinks he's God, although the Egyptians had a very sophisticated conception of sovereignty, and a Pharaoh who would have acted out that conception accurately wouldn't have been the tyrant that Pharaoh was in that story. He was an authoritarian tyrant, and what would you say, his actions violated the principle of something approximating the fundamental value and equality of all individuals, their allegiance, let's say, with something like the divine word. And that means that the society that he had constructed wasn't built on firm ground, even though he thought it was. And he thought the arbitrary expression of power was sufficient. Yep. It's not sufficient at all. It doesn't work at all. It will backfire and take you down. And the story, in part, illustrates that. So why those particular plagues, I don't have enough knowledge to detail that. I'd have to talk to my friend Jonathan Pajot, because he would know.
Why Passover? Why have that element to the story? Why spare the Jewish children? What does that signify?
I don't know. God only knows. what that means. I mean, partly it means that, in any catastrophe, some people are spared the wrath of God, let's say, and some aren't. So it's partly just a reflection of the arbitrary nature of human experience. But that's certainly not all it is. It's tangled up with the idea that the Jews were the chosen people of God. And as, what was it, Tevier in Fiddler on the Roof said, why don't you choose someone else for a change? Yeah, so it's not like that's without its burden. And I have no idea about that at the bottom of things. I mean, the Jews have played a very peculiar and interesting role in the last 10,000 years of civilization, and who can account for it? I mean, they're people of the book, and maybe they were the first people of the book. Mm-hmm. And that's just a cliche in some sense, but people of the book are a completely different kind of people. And you think, well, what's more powerful, a Roman city, Rome itself, or a book? Well, we know the answer to that. It's the book. And how powerful is the book? Well, indefinitely powerful, as far as we can tell. It's literacy itself, and that's part of the raising of the word to the highest status. And the focus on that constitutes Jewish culture to a great degree, well, it's had incalculable consequences for better and worse, for the Jews and I suppose for everyone else. So to be the first people of the book, arguably, at least insofar as the Western tradition is concerned, well, that's not nothing. Who knows what that is? It's something.